I never imagined sharing this, but life has a way of dragging you into the unexpected. My name is Sophia, and I'm 48 years old. I've been a single mother for as long as I can remember, raising my son Mateo alone. He's 25 now, and we've always been very close, just the two of us navigating the ups and downs of life together. One night, something happened that I still don't know how to explain. Mateo had been working hard and studying late, and he looked exhausted. He said he wasn't feeling well. I told him he could lay in my bed for a time to rest. It was one of those cold nights where the house felt colder than usual, so I covered him with a thick blanket. At first, it felt normal, just a mother making sure her son was comfortable. But while Mateo snuggled into the blanket, like it surrounded him with warmth, he softly said, "Mom, I'm cold." At first, I didn't give it much thought, just offering advice. So I let him be, letting him rest against me. His breathing steady, everything felt strangely comforting as he relaxed. I could feel his breathing slow down, as if he was falling asleep. The room was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat echoing in the stillness. I lay there motionless, not wanting to disturb, telling myself this was simply a mother giving her child the reassurance he needed. But then, after a while, he moved again, coming even closer under the blanket. His arm tightened around me, and I stood frozen for a moment, not knowing how to react. A part of me wanted to pull away, say something light to break the tension, but another part of me wanted to stay still. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension I couldn't name, and I felt trapped in the moment, not knowing what to think or feel. Then unexpectedly, I felt something hard under the blanket. My heart began to race. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was nothing, he didn't even notice. But as the minutes passed, my thoughts stirred in ways I didn't expect. The heat between us seemed to increase, and I found myself caught in a strange mix of emotions, confusion, discomfort, and a nervous energy that made it difficult to breathe. Mateo stayed close. His breathing steady, but the silence in the room felt heavy, oppressive. I wanted to move, create some distance, but the words to excuse myself wouldn't come. Then he moved slightly, raising his head to look at me. His eyes had a pressure that I couldn't decipher, gentle, curious, but firm. It made me feel comforted and strangely uncomfortable. He didn't say anything, but his gaze seemed to ask if everything was okay. I forced a small smile, hoping it would dissolve the strange tension, but it only made the silence feel stronger. His hand rested lightly on my arm, his fingers brushing my skin absent-mindedly. It was something so small, so subtle, but it felt electric. Each gentle movement sent sparks through my body that I couldn't ignore. I tried to keep my breathing steady, hoping he wouldn't notice how fast my heart was beating. I didn't know what to do or how to respond. I just stood there, in the quiet intensity of the moment, feeling completely tangled in the connection between us. It wasn't something I could explain, it was just there, unspoken and impossible to ignore. I told myself this was just a mother comforting her son, nothing more. But in the quiet, with just the two of us under the blanket, my thoughts spun in ways I couldn't control. It was my son. But there, so close, I felt something deeper. A connection I didn't fully understand, a mix of confusion and warmth, held me still, making it impossible to pull away. Mateo didn't seem to notice my inner turmoil. He stayed by my side, his hand moving gently over my arm, as if this closeness was completely natural. His breathing was steady, his eyes closed again, and for a moment I wondered if he had fallen asleep. Then his hand moved slowly up my arm, sending a shiver through me. He opened his eyes, looking directly at me, and I froze. His gaze held a question, as if he was asking if this was okay, if I felt the same strange attraction as him. I whispered his name, my voice barely audible. I wanted to stop this, create distance. But I couldn't seem to move. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm quietly building, and neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy with unspoken words of feelings neither of us could articulate. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he leaned closer. My heart was pounding. My mind racing with conflicting thoughts, but I couldn't pull away. I felt torn, trapped between my role as his mother and the unknown emotions had arisen when his face came close to mine. My breathing stopped, and all rational thought faded away, leaving only that moment. Mateo's hand rested gently on my shoulder, his fingers stopping as if he too was doubting. The outside world seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of his presence and the steady rhythm of his breathing. I closed my eyes, trying to calm the chaos in my mind. I told myself to get away, to end the closeness that felt both overwhelming and confusing. But then his hand gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. It was such a small and loving gesture, but it sent a deep ache through my chest, bringing on feelings I couldn't explain. When I opened my eyes, his were fixed on mine, filled with a softness I hadn't seen before. His face was so close I could see every detail, the faint freckles on his nose, the curve of his lips, the way his gaze searched mine. There was vulnerability in his expression that mirrored mine, and I could see that he was as lost in this moment as I was. We stood there, suspended in stillness, as if time itself had stopped. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and confusion, but my body refused to move. I felt drawn to him, this person I had raised. But at that moment, he felt like someone completely new to me. Just when I thought we would remain in this strange, fragile connection forever, Mateo pulled away slightly, breaking the spell. He looked away, his cheeks tinted with color, and let out a shaky laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. The sudden movement brought me back to reality, and I realized how close we had been. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the flood of emotions swirling inside me. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I didn't mean for things to get weird. He avoided my gaze, his words hesitant, as if he was struggling with the same confusion I was. I wanted to comfort him, assure him everything was okay, but the words got stuck in my throat. For the first time in years, I felt uncomfortable around my own son. I finally reached out my hand, resting it on his shoulder. He gave me a small, reassuring smile, hoping it would ease the tension between us. "It's okay, Mateo," I said, my voice soft and firm, although my heart still ached strongly. "It's just that, well, we've been alone for so long, we're probably both feeling a little lost." He nodded, a flicker of relief passing through his eyes. The tension in his throat began to fade, and the heavy feeling between us lightened slightly, until the doorbell rang. The sudden sound shook us both back to the present, like a gust of wind. I quickly stood up, grateful for the interruption. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way to the door, trying to compose myself and calm the storm that was swirling inside me. When I opened it, our neighbor Daniel was standing there. His easy, familiar smile lit up his face. Daniel had always been friendly, the kind of neighbor you'd ask for help when you needed a hand, whether to shovel snow or fix something. But tonight, there was something about the way his eyes lingered on me that felt different. "Hi, Sophia," he said warmly. "I thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything with the colder weather. I can help if there's a problem with the heat or anything else." His words were casual, but his tone was kind, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me, grounding me for the first time in what seemed like hours. "Thanks, Daniel," I replied, smiling. My voice was firm now. "Actually, the house has been a little cold lately. I would appreciate it." As Daniel walked in, I saw Mateo waiting in the hallway, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, but the way he watched us filled the air with a new kind of tension. I looked at him, and for a second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something almost like jealousy. But it faded as quickly as the thought appeared, unsettling me and leaving me wondering if there was more to his silence than he wanted to admit. Daniel moved through the house, checking the heater and chatting with me while I worked. We talked about the weather, the neighborhood, the usual stuff. But I couldn't shake the awareness of Mateo's presence. He stayed silent nearby, his gaze fixed on us. His intensity added an edge to the still room, like an unspoken question in the air. I felt torn, caught between wanting to facilitate Daniel's kindness and being hyper-aware of Mateo, his eyes following my every move. After a few minutes, Daniel turned to me with his smile. Warm as usual. Everything looks good, Sophia, but if something comes up, don't hesitate to call. Thanks, Daniel, I said sincerely, walking him to the door. As he closed it behind him, the silence that filled the house felt heavier than before. When I turned around, Mateo was still standing there with his arms crossed and his expression serious. Are you okay, Mateo? I asked softly, trying to read what was going through his head. He shrugged his shoulders, looking at the floor. Yes, I'm fine. I just didn't expect Daniel to happen, he said. I wanted to say more to bridge the strange gap between us, but before I could, he pushed past me and walked to his room. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me there with a strange mix of relief, confusion, and something much harder to name, a nagging feeling of something unfinished. I looked at his door, my thoughts spinning. The pain in my chest was hard to define, a mix of guilt, longing, and questions I didn't know how to answer. I turned and headed to my room, sitting on the edge of the bed. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, the closeness that Mateo and I had shared, the way his eyes lingered when Daniel was there, and the tension that seemed to grow with each passing moment. I couldn't ignore it forever, but I didn't know how to face it either. Just then, a soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was Mateo. I said, "Come in," trying to keep my voice steady. The door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway with a look on his face I couldn't quite read. He came in silently, closing the door behind him, and sat next to me on the edge of the bed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with all the things that hadn't been said, a weight we both seemed to feel but didn't know how to get rid of. "Mom," he finally began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry if I made things weird before. His voice trailed off. His words hesitated as he looked at his hands, moving nervously. I reached out and placed mine on top of theirs, giving it a gentle squeeze, hoping to ease the tension. "It's okay," I said softly. "Maybe we're both feeling a little lost right now. We've been alone for so long, and sometimes that can make things confusing." He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on his hands. Then he looked at me. His eyes filled with emotions I couldn't decipher, sadness, confusion, and something else. He felt almost vulnerable. I don't know," his voice shook slightly, as if he wasn't sure he would finish the thought. I didn't know what to say. My own heart ached with the same confusion, and for a moment I considered hugging him, telling him that everything would be okay, that we would figure it out together. But I hesitated, not sure if that would help or make things even more complicated. So instead, I stayed still, letting the silence speak for both of us. Finally, I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together. My voice was calm, but inside I felt like I was sailing on uncharted waters, unsure if I was saying the right thing. He nodded again, more slowly this time, and then, to my surprise, he rested his head on my shoulder. It was a gesture that felt as familiar as the days when he was younger and came to me for comfort after a rough day. The weight of his head against me brought a rush of warmth and nostalgia, even as that unspoken tension lingered beneath the surface. Without thinking, I put my arm around him, hugging him in a way that felt both protective and uncertain. It was a comforting gesture, one that reminded me of our bond, even if now it had an edge I couldn't completely ignore. For the first time in a long time, I felt a small sense of peace. Maybe we didn't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to sit together, taking it one step at a time, no matter how complicated things seemed. As we sat in silence, holding on to each other, I allowed myself to believe for a moment that this closeness could somehow overcome the confusion between us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The connection between us was comforting, yes, but also disturbing, like a feeling just below the surface, waiting to come out. And although we stayed like that, as still and calm as the room around us, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. There were things we both felt, things we couldn't name yet, and they wouldn't stay hidden forever. After a while, Mateo raised his head and looked at me with his face serious. "Mom, I don't know what to do with these feelings," he said. "I don't want things to be harder for us, but I can't ignore them either." His words hung in the air like a question he didn't dare ask out loud. I swallowed. My mind was racing as I searched for something to say, but just as I opened my mouth, there was another knock on the door. We both jumped, startled, and looked at each other, taken by surprise. The knock was firm, almost urgent, as if whoever was on the other side knew something was happening, feeling a sudden surge of emotion. Nervous, I got up and opened the door. Daniel was there again, with a worried face. "Sophia, I'm sorry to bother you. I just thought that, well, I wanted to see if everything was okay. You seemed a little strange before." I looked at Mateo, who was watching us closely, his expression unreadable. I tried to keep my voice firm as I answered, "Thanks, Daniel, but we're fine. Just having a quiet night." Daniel looked at me, and then he moved to Mateo with a thoughtful look. "Okay, but remember that I'm right next door if you need anything." After he left, I closed the door and turned to Mateo, who was still watching me with that same intensity. He stood up and walked slowly toward me, and I felt my heart race again. The air between us was heavy with everything that hadn't been said. But just as he reached me, he stopped. His expression changed, as if he was fighting with himself. Maybe we shouldn't force this, Mom," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "Maybe we need time." I nodded. My heart ached with the same conflicting feelings. "You're right, Mateo. We both need to think about everything. Let's not rush this." He nodded too. And we stood there, close but cautious, as if we were on the edge of something we couldn't control. It was an end, but also a beginning, something we couldn't define very well. And as he walked away to his room, I wondered what the future held for us. If you'd like to hear the rest of our story, let us know in the comments below. And we'll share what happens next in part 2.